It's about time. I was getting a bit tired of waiting, the third man of the Irish contingent said. His hair was pale, and his torso was adorned with a golden breastplate, a crimson cape draping off his shoulders. His eyes were a brilliant blue that pierced across the battlefield. Beneath his right eye a beauty mark sat, drawing all attention to it despite its small size. "So, you hunger for battle, then?" the opponent questioned. He had short hair, almost sandy in color, with a pair of eyes that were rimmed with green. His bare chest was toned as if carved from granite, and at his waist a tunic was wreathed. At his side a sword sat sheathed, and upon his head a helm. At his heels winged shoes were tied tightly at his shins. A shield, polished like a mirror, wrapped around his arm. "You see, Setanta and Finn got their fun, so I want to have some." "I understand. I enjoy a good fight too. Let's get to it, eh?" One spear was sent flying, Diarmuid hurling it at his foe. It was knocked aside by his opponent's shield, who came shooting forward. As the distance closed between the two, Diarmuid's second spear was sent shooting, aiming, only to be knocked to the far side of the arena yet again. It was fast and violent, their blades bouncing back and forth against one another. Twisting clouds of dust and debris were sent spiraling up amid their clashing, the polished sword of Perseus meeting the refined edge of the smaller of Diarmuid's swords. As they pulled apart, Diarmuid slid on his heels, looking at Perseus with a careful gaze. "Ah, you're playing cautious, eh?" The Greek warrior raised his shield and sword and poised himself before answering. "Caution is a habit of mine. Those two spears that I allowed to glance off my shield, neither of them were normal. Dodging them gave you a much better chance in this fight, and you're going to need it." Diarmuid, not one to continue the conversation, came charging forward. Perseus's arms braced behind his shield as the little fury hammered into it, the glancing edge scraping against its polished mirror frame. "So, they were both enchanted then, huh? How interesting. And here I felt bad for bearing what I did in this match." Perseus rebuked the attack with a push, his heels leaving the ground and floating above it. You can fly?" "They're on loan, but I can fly." Perseus flashed down, his speed leaving an afterimage of himself. His blade slashed heavily against Diarmuid's sword, the sparks shooting outward from the sheer power. Diarmuid pressed his heels in and thrust Perseus away, the airborne Greek warrior shooting back and regaining balance within his flight. "If flight is the only thing you've got going for you, this isn't going to take long at all!" Diarmuid shouted before taking to the air with a leap, his sword shooting through the air aiming at Perseus. It met his shield and scraped off, Perseus repelling it and causing the Irishman to descend toward the ground. "Now, I did not say that flight was all I had to offer!" Perseus with that flashed down, his winged shoes those of Hermes hurtling him forward with great force, his blade slashing out and across Diarmuid's chest. The Irishman's armor carved away like butter, and he found himself meeting the ground, hard. He struck and rumbled several feet before rolling to a vertical base, recovering. Crimson trickled from the opening in his breastplate, and he shook his head with a sneer. He spat to the side a faint wad of crimson, and charged forward again, seeing Perseus descending. "You should have kept attacking me." Perseus's shield was sent to the wayside after the defensive move, his eyes widening at the power of his foe. "Because giving me a chance is akin to losing the fight!" Diarmuid roared, his blade cleaving through the air and striking down. It cleaved along Perseus's side as the warrior attempted to pull away. His skin tore, and red began to seep outward before flowing. His floating sandals contacted the sand as pain crossed his face. "Which means..." Diarmuid readied his attack and came crossing over, his little fury carving through the air and targeting the Greek warrior. "I win!" The strike carved downward, Perseus, bloodied, bracing as it came. Barely in time, the Greek warrior's shield was placed in the way, the tip of the sword just inches away from his forehead. its gleaming edge shimmering in his field of view, while veins of dust and sand pushed outward from them. Not quite! Perseus sprung backward, the sword scraping down his shield in the process. Diarmuid watched as this evasive maneuver seemingly made Perseus disappear, his helm tipping down and sending him backward in the process. Where did you go? The Fianna looked around with a raised brow, bracing for his foe. He had seen Perseus' speed, but this was different. As he stood there, no attacks made their way toward him. Instead, there was just silence amid the arena. Hiding? Flying too high. Where? Diarmuid questioned, keeping his sword at the ready. On the far side of the arena, where Diarmuid's 2 spears were sent careening, Perseus reappeared, clutching the wound along his side, his free left hand reaching out and pulling free the yellow spear from the wall. I would never do that, but I do know how to beat a tactical retreat. You're over there? How? Diarmuid got no reply. Instead, his spear was sent towards him, the air around it humming as it tore forward. Let's see how you deal with this! Shit! Throwing my own spear? You got me! With a twist, he moved aside and quickly grabbed the shaft as the spearhead ripped by. His heels were pulled from the ground with the sheer strength of his foe, and he was sent careening away over the sands. No! Perseus spoke, flickering forward, first to where Diarmuid had been, then directly in front of him. Now I have you! He delivered a swift swing down at the warrior. Diarmuid's leg, being dragged away by momentum, had shot up. Instinctively, the soul found its way into Perseus' exposed core. The Greek warrior was sent shooting back, his blade narrowly missing a cutting blow, while Diarmuid shot backwards with the spear through the arena wall. Dust flew through the air and choked the center of the arena, swallowing both in its murky, breathless embrace. Then, through the wave of sand and dust, Diarmuid shouted, "That's all you got, you daft bastard!" The spear, which he had captured, ripped through the air, splitting it and the cloud in half, while aiming for Perseus. Perseus pressed to his feet, his winged boots bursting him forward with brilliant speed. The spear was whipped around in his flight, and he closed the distance to meet Diarmuid once more. Not by a long shot! Well, ain't that nice? The two shouted towards each other before Diarmuid hurled a Herculean punch into the Son of Zeus' face. The blow was ground-rattling, and the airborne Greek seemed to pause for a moment before being hurled backwards. His momentum turned into greater force that sent him spiraling. He quickly regained balance and hovered about the arena floor, only to find the little Fury, the lesser of Diarmuid's swords, coming for him. I'm glad you aren't done, because there's a lot more for me to give! Diarmuid felt his blade glancing against Perseus' sword, the warrior holding it back with a grimace and a snicker. Well, if you want to fight tooth and nail, I can do the same! Perseus' foot pushed into Diarmuid's core. The winged shoe kicked off with a blustering wind that sent the Irish demigod careening away. Diarmuid slipped along the sandy floor and jammed his sword into the ground. It cleaved as he dragged to a stop, a grin appearing along his face. Oh, trust me. It is. This is a tournament after all. I want your best! His hand grabbed the second scabbard at his side. The air hummed as the hilt was pulled free from its sheath. As it was drawn, the hum was parted, and the dust was passed over, disappearing as if cleaved 1,000 times. That's the case. Then I shall give you everything you can handle, and more! Perseus blasted forward, his body disappearing with the speed of his winged boots. Not before I finish you off! It was a single swing, the fury that was held in the Irishman's hand being let loose a single time. But what a swing it was. The Colosseum of which they battled was removed entirely, sending stone rocketing to the horizons. The clouds overhead were split in twain, and the air itself seemed to shudder and whip about the attack. More importantly, however, were the 2 polished halves of a shield that came spiraling down from the sky, and the trail of blood that followed them, each half falling into its own puddle of crimson as the source of the blood became visible again. Perseus hovered in the air, a large, gaping slash running from shoulder to his navel, from the left to the right. His left forearm, which held his shield, had been severed entirely from the vicious swing. His eyes were struggling to stay open, as blood rushed from his open mouth and dropped alongside his arm to the ground. Great Hera, Athena, I lost the tools you entrusted me. Diarmuid looked at his airborne foe and found his teeth grinding together. Never had the fury not struck true and left a man alive. I can't believe you survived that! Diarmuid shook his head as the airborne Perseus hung there, bloodied and vulnerable. You have my respect for surviving that swing. Despite that, I'm still gonna win. So surrender or I'll kill you. Perseus gave no reply, his head dropping as his essence continued to spill. The great king was barely even able to breathe. In fact, Diarmuid could not deliver the next strike if he wanted to. Perseus's golden sandals, on loan from the fleet-footed Hermes, suddenly led his body to the ground, as if by their own will, Perseus's frame touching over into a puddle of crimson, dead. In the midst of that moment, great Heracles walked into the space between them, his great-grandfather and half-brother laid on the ground defeated and dead. He was there to merely retrieve the body. Take your victory. It was well earned. Those words, though bearing no direct intent, pushed into Diarmuid's core. Heracles' anger, restrained from years of tests and trials, let itself known. I will. You're the opponent I'm looking forward to fighting. Don't lose. Worry more for yourself. The god of might looked to the Irish demigod and shook his head. And soon, the final match of the first round was upon us.